Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining from today. My name is Anherad Lang. It's a great pleasure to welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Make or Break, the Implications of COVID-19 for Crisis Financing, organized by the Norwegian Refugee Council and PHAP. My name is Anherad Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection, and very pleased to have the opportunity to serve as your host today. This webinar is the launch event for NRC's new report with the same title. We'll be learning about the main findings of the report and take that as the starting point for our panel discussion on the humanitarian financing structure. So with the technical notes out of the way, we'll turn to the substance of today's event. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to challenges for all aspects of humanitarian work across the globe, including for how humanitarian emergency response is being funded during the response to the pandemic. But it has also provided a form of live stress test for the overall fitness of the international crisis financing system. It has tested the international crisis response and financing system in novel ways, aggravating well-known challenges, and casting light on unanticipated areas of weakness. At the same time, under the Grand Bargain humanitarian financing reforms, stakeholders have been taking stock of the progress made and considering priorities for future reform agendas. So with this in mind, and although we are still in the middle of this pandemic and our response to it is still in an early stage, NRC wanted to take the opportunity to examine what the pandemic response tells us of the international crisis financing system for the longer term, and therefore commissioned a study to this effect. In today's session, we'll be taking a starting point in this study, looking at the main findings with one of the study's authors, and then we'll launch into a panel discussion in which we'll look at the role and fitness of the existing humanitarian financing structure and how the system should evolve to be able to respond to crises of this complexity. So before we introduce our panel, we'll take a look in some detail at the study. And for that purpose, I'm pleased to introduce Lydia Poole, a humanitarian policy consultant who has been a lead author on the study. Welcome, Lydia. Okay, Lydia, I think you're unmuted now. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here and very excited that so many of you have dialed in.
Absolutely. So just to start us off, Lydia, could you walk us through the main findings of the study? What aspects of the existing crisis financing system worked well and what didn't? Over to you.
Yes, thank you. So as you mentioned in your introduction, the pandemic really enabled us to see some of the ways in which the humanitarian or the whole international crisis financing system actually, because we don't only look at humanitarian financing in the report, we look at a much wider scope of international support to crisis response. So to look at how the international crisis financing system performs under circumstances of extreme pressure. So that enabled us to identify a number of areas where it looks as if reforms and investments have paid off and have been working well. And it also helps us to identify some problematic ways in which the system defaults towards behaviours that might not be consistent with some of our policy aspirations, or where there might still be disincentives that run counter to some of our policy commitments. And it's also highlighted a number of areas where the system needs some major rethinking and investment if we're going to have a crisis financing system that enables us to be prepared and respond to a world in which we're more likely to be facing these large-scale systemic crises that the pandemic is really one of the first high-profile examples of that really should give us pause for reflection on how well prepared we are. So in terms of some of the things that worked well and didn't work well, so first of all, I think important to note that in this crisis response, substantial sums of money were mobilized relatively quickly. Appeals were launched in February and March, and problematic those funding appeals always are. Certainly they got moving quickly, and money started to arrive into those appeals from March, April onwards. And then I think one of the big stories really was that the international financing institutions showed up in a big way in response to the pandemic. So some really huge sums of money being committed from particularly the World Bank, who committed to provide 160 billion in financing, thinking about February, and also the IMF, who announced that they would provide 250 billion in financing for the crisis response. So really huge sums of money compared to what we would often see in a more lower profile crisis response where there's largely humanitarian actors involved. So after this initial surge of commitments and mobilizing of appeals, certainly on the humanitarian funding side, the funding commitments of new funding started to tail off around April. And at the time that we were writing the report, there was quite a lot of concern about how the system would be able to mobilize sufficient funding for the long tail of the crisis. So the secondary impacts that were starting to become evident, and particularly food security crises. And if we look at the outlook for efficient development assistance financing, ODA, and also for private financing, which often provides a significant proportion of humanitarian crisis financing response, the outlook for both of those sources of funding look extremely challenging into 2021 as donor economies start to deal with the economic and fiscal implications of the crises in their own countries. So some real questions there about the extent to which an essentially discretionary funding system that's largely based on a relatively limited pot of money is able to accommodate these large-scale peaks in demand, but also to sustain financing across the long tail of the secondary and longer-term impacts of this sort of crisis. So some other areas that the system worked well and perhaps less well in some areas. If we look at the architecture itself, some of the real standout success stories are where investments have been made to, in effect, prime the pump to make sure that funding is in place in advance of a crisis, or the systems to move money around the system have been put in place in advance of a crisis. So predictable and flexible funding, what we would term in the context of the grand bargain quality funding, was really the standout success story in terms of enabling humanitarian organizations to mobilize early action to prepare for the pandemic and to adapt their existing operations to altered operating environments where they couldn't necessarily access populations and deliver some of the programs that they had planned to do. So that this predictable and flexible funding really enabled the most cost-effective and frictionless financing response, and it enabled the earliest action. Some established financing instruments also performed relatively well. So the OCHA's country-based pooled funds and the UN Central Emergency Response Fund responded quickly. They started to disperse funds quickly, and they were also able to adapt to feedback from recipient organizations to the new and more complex context in which they were operating. So also some of the financing instruments developed by the international financing institutions after the global financial crisis to help them equip themselves better to respond to crises also performed well. So catastrophe deferred drawdown options releasing funding quickly, and the IMF's catastrophes containment fund also was able to provide debt relief relatively quickly. So the established instruments work quite well. The newer ones struggled to attract funding. And perhaps one of the least successful instruments that we saw in this crisis was the Pandemic Emergencies Facility, which was in fact designed for exactly this sort of scenario, but which, because of its complex design, ended up dispersing quite late and ultimately provided a relatively small amount of money, 196 million, which was to be divided between 64 countries. So I think some real questions there. We should have some, I think, pause for reflection on the role that heavily engineered, complex financing instruments might have versus the complex reality often of crises, and also the extent to which we should be pinning our hopes on mobilizing funding from financial markets to provide some of the financing that we might need to cover the major gap in risk financing. So one of the other areas that the system really struggled was to move money quickly to where it was most needed. So within the humanitarian system, we saw a strong default bias towards the UN system, so towards UN agencies and funds in the first instance. So while money did start to trickle through the system as time moved on, certainly at the beginning there was quite a bit of frustration from international and national NGOs that they were not receiving significant allocations of new funding, and that money was relatively slow to reach them as it did work its way through the system. And then from the perspective of the international financing institutions, much of the financing that they provided was in the form of loans, which tends to naturally end up with countries who can afford to borrow, which tends not to be the poorest and definitely the most indebted countries. So I think at the time of writing, there was analysis that indicated that of the commitments so far from the IFIs, only about 11% of that was for low-income countries. One of the other, I think, interesting stories to note about the pandemic response was that although fostering greater collaboration across the humanitarian development peacebuilding nexus is a high-level policy priority, we didn't see a lot of that in practice. And whilst it's definitely welcome news that the IFIs are now an established part of the financing landscape in crisis response, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are now working together in coherence. In reality, what happened was that most institutions went off and developed their own planning and prioritization and resource mobilization tools and initiatives without necessarily talking to each other. So we ended up with a kaleidoscope of different planning response plans, which is extremely difficult for donors to navigate, very difficult to know where money was within the response. And then the IFIs are also negotiating directly with governments and probably not participating in some of those more collaborative planning processes, so adding another layer of complexity to that challenge. The funding response itself was probably quite uneven. So some significant initial funding for the humanitarian response, large volumes brought in by the World Bank and the IMF and some of the regional development banks. And to quote one of our interviews, who I won't name in the report, but they described brilliantly that not much funding for everything that falls between masks and budget support. So some real questions there about the extent to which funding for other aspects of development programming received attention within the overall financing response, which potentially could prove more problematic as the response enters the later stages of dealing with the secondary consequences of the crisis. I think one of the other interesting areas to note where the system performed well in some areas and not so well in others, and which is also related to this challenge of working collaboratively and coherently across all of these different constituencies, is around decision making. And as you will no doubt have observed from the responses that your own governments have grappled with, this was an extremely difficult challenge to deal with. It continues to be so. Very difficult to predict the public health crisis, how that was going to play out, and then very difficult to predict the cascading consequences as we enter the socioeconomic impacts of the crisis. So an extremely difficult proposition in terms of decision making. But as we know, you definitely don't want to be trying to figure out how you make decisions in the heat of a crisis. So I think there are some real gaps there in terms of how the international system comes together to make difficult decisions, to prioritize and to allocate resources and mobilize resources in the crisis. On the other hand, aspects of the humanitarian system probably perform quite well in that respect. And I think there we can say that probably the many years of careful investment in coordination, in information systems like the financial tracking service and in the appeals process have paid off relatively well. The appeals actually were, I think, on balance, thought to have worked reasonably well. The UN's humanitarian response plan, it responded to critique and feedback and adapted and incorporated feedback from networks of NGOs and other constituencies. And was able to draw on these existing relationships and years of investment in these systems. Similarly, the IASC Results Group 5 played a critical role in trying to broker significant concessions to try and increase the flexibility of funding. So I think certainly we can learn something there from the experiences of the humanitarian system in investing in our coordination, business intelligence, and decision-making processes in advance of the crisis. What do we make of all this then? I think in the introduction, I think I might have talked about this being quite a bleak reading of how the system responded. I think actually what I described earlier there's quite a lot that we can say that worked quite well, and we can see some of the efforts of previous reforms and investments paying off quite well. But if we take a step backwards and look at how well prepared we are in fact for major crises of the future, I think probably we might read this information and analysis quite differently. So historically, the humanitarian system and the wider international crisis system uses major crises as an important stimulus for learning and adaptation. But typically the crises of the past, even the large-scale ones, tend to have been quite geographically contained, and the reforms that flowed from that were relatively incremental. So they left the system essentially more or less intact. But the pandemic is really a systemic crisis, so it's no longer contained within the geographical boundaries of a single country or even a region. The shocks were transmitted along complex networks and systems that form the foundation of our integrated global economy and that leave us all vulnerable. And not only are these cascading consequences difficult to predict, they're also more likely to happen in the future, not only because we're heavily dependent on these systems, but also because we continue to increase our vulnerability to shocks through continuing to warm the climate and to degrade the ecosystems that the entire foundation of our current systems are grounded in. So we can expect to see more of these large-scale systemic crises in the future, which will be periodically overlaid on top of them in existing and often in recent years growing caseload of long-term and chronic humanitarian needs. So how do we then build a system which is capable of responding to these huge challenges? I think in some respects we're probably not even at the point of asking the right questions yet. I think we're still very much focusing on looking at internally at how to make relatively small-scale reforms within the scope of the system that we already have, when this really is an opportunity to ask some more fundamental questions about how we could prepare ourselves better for this very challenging future. So I'm not going to go through all of the recommendations in detail because I think we can pick up perhaps on some of those in the question and answer session, and also because I think we're all keen to move on to the panel discussion as well. I'm just going to pick up on a few of the key themes that I think would be important for us to discuss today. So the first is around investing in a system-wide pivot towards preparedness. So I think one of the ways in which we could start to address some of the problems that have long dogged the system and which would help us to fulfill some of our aspirations to work in greater coherence across the nexus would be to place risk at the center of the enterprise of humanitarian development and peacebuilding action, and for that to be the analytical lens and the organizing principle through which we understand and prioritize our engagement. That would help to deliver realistic prioritization and investment plans for investing in local national responsive capacity that would help to take us beyond nice sounding commitments to invest in local and national capacity, and which would help to orient development investments towards investing in the systems that are fundamental to a response on the scale that we have seen is necessary for this type of crisis. So particularly investing in social protection systems and in public health systems and in risk surveillance systems. So the second point I wanted to mention is about the need to invest in and upgrade the international crisis system itself. And one of the areas which I think it's really important to put back on the table is how we finance crisis response itself. This is something which was picked up in the high-level panel on humanitarian financing. If you remember back that far in the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit, the question of sufficiency, how do we grow the pot, how do we diversify the funding base, was a question which was looked at, but then which was not taken up in the Grand Bargain humanitarian financing reforms and has really fallen off the agenda. But I think if we're going to address some of the more fundamental problems of the system that we have now, we're going to have to revisit how the system is financed. If we continue to rely on a discretionary system, we will always be late, it will always be unpredictable, and there'll never be enough. So we need to think much more radically about how we finance what is in effect a global public good, providing safety nets for the most vulnerable in times of acute crisis. It's a difficult problem, but it's not impossible, and it definitely requires intellectual effort and leadership. And then the final point I wanted to raise is around how we finance the system. So there's lots of detailed technical issues that we raise in the report about how to build a better financing ecosystem to move money where it's needed at the right times. I think the one that I'd really like to emphasize is the need to, in effect, fund the system as if you really cared about it and as if you believed in it. And by that, I'm talking about providing predictable, flexible, timely funding, otherwise known as quality funding in the context of the Grand Bargain. So this is, as we've clearly seen in the response to this crisis, what delivers the most efficient, timely, responsive humanitarian response. There are definitely lots of barriers to politically to providing more of this and various reservations about why we should do it, but the bottom line is that this is the best way to provide the most predictable and efficient response. So I'll stop there and open up for questions. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Lydia. Indeed, we had several questions coming in as you spoke. We don't have a lot of time, but I think we can squeeze in one or two before we move on. First, and just as you were wrapping up there, you mentioned that flexible quality funding was one of the best performing areas. So the question is, what are the reasons that you found why we are not doing more of that? Back to you, Lydia.
I think the reasons are often political, and one of the reasons that was noted quite clearly in the study was that the donors who are performing as good citizens and providing this quality, flexible funding, they really don't get much recognition for it. So the donors who were getting accolades for providing additional funding were the ones who were sitting on funding and then providing it, with some fanfare later in the process. The donors who has provided upfront predictable funding at the beginning of the year didn't receive much recognition for that. So there's some disincentives built into the system. And there are some real problems around how donors are able to account for that funding to counter concerns that they might have in their domestic constituencies about what their governments are doing and about how their aid budget is being spent. These are technical problems which I think can be overcome, and I think which are being tabled and taken forward in the context of the Grand Bargain. But I think that it's an area where a great deal of bravery and political commitment is probably going to be needed on the side of donors, and I think there's a real fundamental discussion that needs to be had about whether there is a willingness and appetite to do that.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. There was another point coming up, I see, from several people in the Q&A, and that was how the study urges caution regarding the role of market-based risk transfer mechanisms. I wonder if you could very briefly tell us a bit more about why we should moderate our expectations in this area. Back to you.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a contentious area. I think it's something which a great deal of hope and expectation has been pinned on from the humanitarian sector, that given the funding constraints that we have, that perhaps we would be able to mobilize substantial additional funds through mobilizing private investment through risk transfer instruments like insurance and swaps and bonds. And I think obviously these will play a role in the future, but we need to be cautious about the cost efficiency of some of these. And also in the context of a global recession, probably we need to be a bit circumspect about the extent to which there will be sufficient capital available for this sorts of investment, and whether they will have the risk appetite to invest in these sorts of products in the future. It's notable that the Pandemics Emergencies Facility has been quietly discontinued. I think there's a lot of controversy around that particular instrument, questions as to whether it provided real value for money, and also whether it was sufficiently flexible to cope with the sort of complex reality of a crisis in the real world.
Great. Thanks a lot, Lydia. We may have time for more Q&A later in the session, but at this point, I think we'll move on to the panel discussion. I will start by very briefly introducing our panelists. So we are very thankful to be joined by a set of panelists who have made time during these very busy weeks, including with the opening of the UN General Assembly. So to start off with, a big thank you to all of you for being able to make the time today. First, we're very pleased to have with us today Mark Lowcock, UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. Welcome, Mark. I think we'll...
Thank you very much.
Great, good. We use it as an opportunity to just do a final check on audio, so that's terrific. Glad that you could be here. Glad that you could be here, Mark. We're also joined by Susanne Mikael, Head of Humanitarian Aid at the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA. Susanne has not yet joined us. She'll be here momentarily. So we'll see her very soon. And we also have with us Hibak Kalfan, Director of the NEAR Network. Welcome, Hibak.
Thank you.
Great to have you here as well. And we're very glad to have with us Jan Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Welcome back, Jan. Great to have you on one of our webinars again.
Thank you, Angara. Good to see you.
Great. Yes, good to see you too. And finally, last but not least, we're joined by Ben Parker, Senior Editor at the New Humanitarian. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Okay. Very glad to have you with us, Ben. There was a little bit of an echo. I'm sure that my colleague Marcus is on top of that now. So, as already indicated in the presentation on the NRC study, if there is something that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us, it's that we were not ready to respond to this sort of large-scale systemic crisis. The report, in fact, gives a fairly grim outlook of the way that the crisis financing system has responded. NRC claims that we are in a, quote, make or break moment that could and should redefine the way that we respond to crises in the future. So, Jan, I'd like to turn to you first. What is your take on the situation? Over to you, Jan.
Thank you. Thanks to Lydia. Thanks to the NRC team in Geneva. I think it's an important report. And yes, it's make or break. Mostly break, actually, because needs doubled, tripled, quadrupled in many areas because of the pandemic. The last pandemic of this kind was 100 years ago, so we're in a once-in-a-century challenge. I'd also like to acknowledge that the system, of course, is bigger, better, more prepared, under Mark Lowcock as Emergency Relief Coordinator in 2020 than it was when I was the Emergency Relief Coordinator 15 years ago. Our point in this report is that we're not even close to where we should be given the needs. and given the explosion of needs, the medical because of the virus, and even much more so because of the socioeconomic meltdown for hundreds and hundreds of millions. So if we got 10 or 20% more funding eventually, too late, but some increase, we're not able to respond to a 200 or 300% increase in needs around us. The test that I hope we can all agree on is, of course, Hudeida and Barçaloga in Burkina Faso or Bolivar in Venezuela. It's what we're able to do to respond to real needs there. The Hudeida test is what we should be using on whether or not we succeed with humanitarian financing. And I think it's mostly breaking. It's not making. Now, what I feel is that the system, which are all of the donors, all of the financial institutions, all of the large agencies, were not able to provide sufficient resources early enough to the frontline responders, the local, the national, the regional and international NGO, civil society organizations, and some of the UN agencies. And now it's even worse to see that we are not even close to having the funding needed and ability to respond to the socioeconomic meltdown. The secondary impact. We're launching a new report on that later in this month, Angarad, and we were shocked actually when we saw how many people are not even able to put food in their mouth that had income before the pandemic. Now, I won't go into much detail, but maybe I'll take the case of NRC, the organization I'm leading now. We have 15,500 field workers. We are able to respond. What was our experience? Well, the good news was that we have two framework agreements, one with Norway and one with Sweden. That is a program-based approach. We can move money around within a country from one program to the other within the country. There's a lot of flexibility. We got added flexibility within the frameworks that are, several 1, 2, 3 years ahead of time. We know how much money we have. And we also got more flexibility from the other good donors with the money we had already received for 2020. The bad news is that the framework agreements and this program-based approach is 15% of our funding. With most donors, we start from zero every single year. And the even worse news is that we're privileged. Most of the local NGOs, civil society groups, actually also international NGOs, they have 1%, 2%, 5% predictability to start with. Now, final point on the big money. The Hudeida test will really succeed when we can find out how to get the big international financial institutions money, the development money, to field responder, frontline responders. If I had a penny for every seminar where I have discussed the nexus the last years, I could fund, the Hudeida response. It's been too many seminars, groups, subgroups, compacts. We're not either able to get the private sector enough involved. There is a lot of untapped potential there. So I think the challenge is pretty clear. We need to do better, and we hope that the pandemic, once in a century event, could help us get a new and better system that is able to respond to real needs. Back to you.
Got it. Thank you, Jan. Thank you very much. I know that Mark Lowcock will have to leave shortly, so I'm going to go now to a couple of questions to Mark. The first is a follow-up here, building on Jan's comments. So to Mark, the report highlights how increasing preparedness and getting ahead of the crisis is the right strategy, and yet it also raises doubts as to whether we're being too hopeful in relying on anticipatory financing. What have you learned from anticipatory action that can help us in responding to this crisis, and what is the role that it can play in the future? Over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Let me first say congratulations to NRC. I think this is a really good report. It's a very timely report, and you basically identified all of the right issues, I think. This is the biggest crisis the world has seen for 50 years. And as Bill and Melinda Gates have just said in their new report, there's a danger that over the last 25 weeks, we have put back development progress by 25 years. The way this has played out is the virus has closed down the global economy, which has led to a big contraction in the economies of very fragile countries, which has meant that tens of millions of people around the world can't put food on the table, which has made them more malnourished. At the same time, health services have disappeared. And as we all know, what kills people who are malnourished is mostly things like the measles or an infection. But those malnourished people can no longer get those services. Now, I think there's a lot of dancing around, frankly, what the real problem is here. The real problem is not the absence of institutions or knowledge to fix the problem. The real problem is a huge lack of funding, completely disproportionate to the scale of the crisis we have. So just to illustrate, the OECD and the G20 have poured $11 trillion into the global economy just to protect their own economies and their own citizens. And they were right to do that. That was the right thing to do. That amounts to about 10% of global national income. The most fragile countries can't do that because they don't have the resources or the access to markets or the policy capability or space and the rest of it. So they're reliant on the international financial institutions. They're also a lot more vulnerable, obviously, than the rich countries. But what the international institutions have done for those fragile countries amounts not to 10% of national income, but to 2%. And that's why we've got this, this huge problem. It's a bit like, I spent most of Sunday talking to people all over Yemen, which is one of the countries with the worst problems at the moment. And of course, aid is being cut to people all over Yemen at the moment. And even as the pandemic brings on all these other problems. And what a Yemeni man said to me is, what is happening is like a man dying of thirst being given a few drops of water. And that's what lots of Yemenis are experiencing. But it's also the experience in many, many other places. So somehow we need to find a way to get the policymakers to use the tools in their toolkit, which, by the way, happened largely in 2008-9 because the shareholders of the IFIs then instructed the institutions to use more of the tools in the toolkit in a way that hasn't happened this year, allocating SDRs, more generous debt payment suspension, front-loading more resources, and so on. There's a lot of space still to do a lot of that, which, by the way, has minimal fiscal cost to the richer countries because the resources are largely on the balance sheets of the IFIs already. And it's it's dangerous that this is not happening because these problems are going to accumulate. We're not at peak pandemic in the most fragile countries yet, but we're a long, long way from the peak of the consequences of the pandemic. It's also quite surprising that these things haven't been done. because they were done in 2008-9. And of course, that is a commentary, unfortunately, on the state of geopolitics. But somehow we need to get the better off countries in their own interest, because the problems that are brewing will come back to bite them, to, to focus on what really needs to be done now, because unfortunately, time is running out. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. And I know that you have to run. We do have one more question, which we can try to squeeze in briefly, and then I know you'll take your leave. You were speaking, Mark, about the quantity of funds, simply. There are also questions clearly coming up regarding the structures, humanitarian financing structures. The initial international crisis financing responses to the pandemic have been rapid and substantial, and yet, as some of our participants have been writing in, there is little evidence of coherence, and the financing response being really across the nexus, the humanitarian development, peace-building nexus. So the question is, what could be the role of international financial institutions, and what changes would our structures, humanitarian financing structures, need in order to fully realize this potential? Over to you, Mark.
Well, I do agree we need to find a way more automatically to finance responses in the most fragile countries to really, really big problems. It's not the case, though, that we've seen substantial responses. That's a myth. It's quite a dangerous myth, actually. What we've seen is deeply inadequate responses, particularly in relation to the scale of the problem. People get blinded by the dollar sign. They need to keep their minds on, well, how does that compare to the size of the problem? I actually think, like Jan, basically the institutional arrangements have performed okay. Certainly I admire greatly what the humanitarian agencies have done. I think the managements in the IFIs have done what they've been allowed to do. The problem is they haven't been allowed to do what it is necessary to do. So I don't think we need to, I think it would be, particularly now, when we should be trying to convey the message that we've got the tools in the toolkit, we know what needs to be done, we can stop this getting a lot worse, but only if you act in a different way now. Now is the wrong time to revisit the wiring of the system.
Got it. Thank you very much. And I know you have to go. Thanks so much for being with us, Mark. Very good. So I think Susanne is not yet with us. So I'm going to turn to Hibak. I'd like to turn to you next on a topic that your organization has done great work in, promoting a locally led response. One of the findings of the study is that despite high-level policy commitments to localization, when under stress, the humanitarian financing system defaults to familiar partners. This means that the majority of new funding has initially been channeled through UN agency and funds, and that NGOs, and especially national NGOs, have not gotten the support that they need. There is, however, a recognition that to strengthen preparedness and risk monitoring, regional, national, and local actors are key. So beside funding not reaching frontline responders, Hibak, what else can the system do to enable preparedness and support locally led response? Over to you, Hibak.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank NRC for the invitation today, and to thank my fellow panelists for their perspectives on how we can improve our work collectively. My fellow panelists have spoken about overall financing inclusive of IFIs, but I'd like to focus on the need to better coordinate and to focus on what we can do better within the humanitarian financing infrastructure. I think it's important to reference recognition versus action. While one has increased, the other still faces immense barriers. Since 2016, there have been commitments such as those included in the Grand Bargain to support frontline responders with a focus on sector-wide improvement, on quantity and quality of funding, partnership, reporting, capacity strengthening, just to name a few. Yet to date, we know that achievements are sparse, and unfortunately the reality is still quite far from our overall aspirations. We at NEAR conducted a survey inviting local and national NGO perspectives on the implementation and impact of the Grand Bargain for the year of 2019, right at the onset of COVID-19. We received around 93 responses from a very wide geographical spread, and 83% of those respondents said they had not seen an increase of funding in 2019. And as you mentioned in your question, very limited, if any, new funding is currently reaching or reached local and national organizations. Instead, a majority of COVID-19 related initiatives in the Global South were coming from domestic crowdsourced funding and really repurposing of already existing grants, which allowed for really a scattered and limited response with a lot of border issues and access and movement. As a sector, we really do have a real opportunity to learn from COVID-19 in order for the ecosystem, including local and international actors, to improve our ability to prepare for any future large-scale crisis. A real coordinated effort needs to be made in fulfilling localization commitments, beginning with traditional and non-traditional donors. For us, true scalability is created with local actors, not in our absence. And some practical suggestions that I think we'd like to put forward as NEAR as a voice of our members and local and national organizations to enable preparedness and a coordinated response are really a few things. For donors to use a diverse ecosystem of localized funding mechanisms, not just limited to the ones we have now, but really thinking about community foundations, national funds, to really allow for diverse local organizations to be supported within while limiting the administrative burden on donors. It's important for donors to continue to use the OCHA-based pool funds where appropriate. Yet, within our current humanitarian financing infrastructure, the SURF and the country-based pool funds also need to do their part in becoming more accessible to local and national NGOs. In some countries, they're leading by example, but in others, they have quite a way to go. We also need donors to be more specific with UN and INGO grantees, improvement on multi-year funding, risk sharing, increased overhead costs for all actors should become a norm. And there should also be, I think, a recognition that risk is inherent, and the cultivation of shared responsibility and co-ownership of risks should also become a norm. Finally, it's extremely important to both include local and national organizations in the current coordination mechanisms, but also support existing and informal national and subnational coordination mechanisms. Such support can ensure, in our minds, timely coordination and quicker response in future crises. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Hibak. So I'd like to turn now to Ben. So Ben, you've been covering this overall theme at the New Humanitarian and before that as well. What's your opinion of the report and of what's been said so far in this session today? And in particular, I wonder if you see something that you think may have been left out of the discussion. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks for the opportunity to join this conversation. And I thought the report was very timely and an excellent survey of what needs to be discussed. I'm also delighted that we have a proper debate, because we have on one hand Lydia saying it's time to have a look at how the system works, and the boss of the system saying it's the wrong time to revisit the wiring of the system. So it's always good when you have some different opinions in the room. Well, one of them's left, but never mind. I can't imagine how you could look, with all the greatest respect, how you could look at the way the system works today and say it should stay the way it is. If you were to invent a more complicated and inadequate system, you would struggle. The way the money flows, the way that chunks of the money, percentages of the money are lifted by various intermediaries along the way, and the fact that, I think it was maybe Jan's analogy, but you have a fire engine which has no water in it as your basic model. So I welcome this era. One of the few positives I personally can see in the era we're now living through is that radical thought is now permissible and even becoming more welcome and more conventional, given the scale of the problems that we face. So in general terms, my reaction so far is that we haven't talked about rights, we haven't talked about justice, we haven't talked about fairness. I don't think it's giving a few drops of water to the man who is dying of thirst. I think it's giving like a bag of rice to a man who is dying of thirst with somebody's knee on his neck. The reason people suffer is frequently, and the large majority of the caseload that we call humanitarian, is man's inhumanity to man, and person's humanity into persons. So I think there is a space now for a rethink of roles and concepts of justice and neutrality and political engagement and solidarity in the humanitarian space. And I think the apolitical, depoliticized culture that has dominated the sort of Junantist sector is looking pretty tatty. And more exciting radical analysis on inequality, on climate, and on racial justice and other forms of inequality and oppression. We, in this non-profit sector, need to engage with it and not pretend it's not about to change everything. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ben. Very, very useful analysis there of the discussion. Really appreciate that. I think we have now Susanne on the line. So the theme of quality funding, we were speaking about quality funding, flexible funding. The study recognizes that flexible funding is a low cost but high impact means of increasing system responsiveness, as Lydia discussed at the beginning. However, this is clearly still quite limited. We know that Sweden is highly recognized as a champion on quality funding. So would like to ask you, Susanne, what are why are some of the other donors so reluctant? The study points at a system of disincentives to provide quality funding. How did Sweden get past those disincentives, and what can Sweden do to convince others? Over to you, Susanne.
Thank you so much. And I'm a little bit unsure. Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So flexible funding then. First of all, I have to admit, and I have to start with, that there's a little bit of course, a dilemma when it comes to flexible funding. Because the question here, the biggest question probably is flexibility of whom? Whose flexibility? So naturally, the less flexible you are as a donor, the more flexible a humanitarian agency on the ground can become. Because in a way, as a donor, you delegate that flexibility to, let's say, NRC, UNICEF, etc. But at the same moment as you have done that, then of course your own flexibility diminishes. So it's what I'm trying to say, it's a difficult decision to take to ensure that high level of flexibility to implementing partners. And it is a dilemma for sure. But SIDA has taken that firm decision to delegate as much as possible of its own flexibility to ensure that sort of flexibility for agencies on the ground. Why? Because we believe in that the best decisions are taken close to the response. Proximity to response here is urgent. That's the first reason. But B, we also think that flexible funding is merely a technicality that relies on something much more important or much greater in a sense, which is the foundation for our humanitarian assistance, which, as you know, of course, is based on the four humanitarian principles. So when you start that way, when we start with a foundation that is strictly principle-based, impartiality, independence, etc., then the main goal of your humanitarian assistance is not so much exposure as a donor, but rather an efficient humanitarian response. Hence, there's a push factor to delegate flexibility as close to the ground as you possibly can be. So for that reason, we have 4 main tools of financing. So the most flexible is probably the rapid response mechanism. It's a set of financial resources that are already by January dedicated to each agency on the ground. NRC, of course, one of them, but all of our strategic partners. This means that any organization can, within 24 hours, establish a humanitarian presence where needs are most severe. Again, there's a delegation of flexibility, but because, of course, if we had dispersed this funding already in January, that means there's less of an emergency reserve in the pockets of SIDA. But so it's a very careful calculation we need to take, but it's worth that sort of diminished flexibility on our behalf. Then, of course, the second tool is the PBA, as I know that John alluded to earlier. It's a program-based approach, so we're moving strategically from project-based financing to program-based financing. Again, because we believe that, let's say, an Action Against Hunger or an NRC or a UNICEF office on the ground is best placed to take those decisions in terms of where the humanitarian response is needed, when, and how. So the PBA, the program-based approach, and the rapid response mechanism are probably our strongest tools in terms of flexible financing. But again, these are financing tools and nothing but financing tools. You can only push for these sorts of tools if you already rely heavily on a foundation that directs your humanitarian assistance. And that foundation is the humanitarian principles. And one of them, of course, is that humanitarian action is based on needs alone, and that severity must direct humanitarian action, and making no distinction between ethnicity and gender, etc. So you trust organizations on the ground to be able to ensure the impartiality principle. Hence, you ensure flexible financing. And I have to say that these flexible financing, and now we're reverting to the second part of your question when it comes to our dialogue with other donors. I think there's only one way to promote these sort of flexible financing, and that's showing concretely, tangibly, measurably how these affect the humanitarian response on the ground. SIDA was, as you know, one of the first humanitarian donors to really bridge a critical gap in Somalia in 2017 in the midst of a famine crisis to ensure large segments of humanitarian flows, financing flows to the Somalia-based organizations before even some of the major other donors came into the picture. But also the rapid response mechanism, in the midst of the outflow of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar to Bangladesh, we could use the rapid response mechanism no less than 20 times in less than 3 weeks to ensure a quick humanitarian response on the ground. And when I say we, I would say mainly the humanitarian strategic partners that we have a strategic partnership with. Because within days, we were flooded basically by 24-hour rapid response mechanism to be able to ensure that fast response on the ground. And COVID-19 is no exception to these sort of examples, where we in less than a couple of years could respond to a number of critical, very field-oriented humanitarian responses through more than 5 or 6 humanitarian agencies through the rapid response mechanism. But of course, that sort of flexibility, it's a constant dilemma, because delegating flexibility to humanitarian actors on the ground means, of course, in reality, that there's less flexibility to a donor, let's say in this case, SIDA.
Great. Thank you very much, Susanne. I have a follow-up question, staying on the theme of quality funding. This is a follow-up to Jan, and then I'll be coming back to you, Susanne, because we do have a couple of questions coming in specifically asking about a donor perspective. So do stay tuned. But now to Jan, when we talk about quality funding, we mean predictable, flexible, reliable funding, as we understand. How has an increased focus on short-term financing impacted implementing organization capacity to respond to sudden crises? Over to you, Jan.
Well, it's a fundamental thing that we are getting little preventive funding, little preparedness funding, little flexible funding, little predictable funding. Sweden, as I already said, Susanna, is a very good example of a good donor in this respect. Most donors, and those donors who are bigger than Sweden, often do not delegate this flexibility precisely because they want to look good on television when a big crisis erupts. And I was the Deputy Foreign Minister of Norway for 7 years. I was responsible for the Norwegian humanitarian funding, and I admit I I felt it was important that Norway had some visibility. We could announce big pledges. We could look good at donor conferences, etc. This is way back in the 1990s. And indeed, those donors who have now given us all of this flexibility and predictability, they cannot give the big pledges anymore because in a way they've delegated to us. I think it's the right thing to delegate to local organizations like the NEAR network, etc. But it's the right thing because we are on the ground. I mean, CEDA doesn't have 15,500 field-based workers, or our local organizations in Hodeidah, Yemen. The way the donors should do is evaluate us critically by every second year or whatever, and then take away funding for those organizations who are wanting. Again, maybe also to Ben, I share the frustration 100%. But do we want 100 seminars in Geneva to look at the structure of the system? Or do we really want to have results in Hodeidah? I think we need to change also the system. One of the ways of doing it is the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that is in the International Monetary Fund and in the World Bank and in the Development Bank and from the bilateral development donors. That money we're not seeing it in the frontline responder life, and that would need a new structure. I think the Interagency Standing Committee should have met long time ago, much more intensively with the donor group to instrumentalize good humanitarian donorship. They've gotten this example of Sweden to be followed throughout Europe, North America, the Gulf donors and so on, and work for that. There are structures. They should work harder.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'll now turn to Susanna. Again, we have a couple of questions that are related. I'm going to combine them here. And so first, Paulina is writing, it has been highlighted that the relevance of local and national actors to better handle systemic crises. From a donor perspective, what strategies do you have in place, or what are you trying to implement to foster localization? How is this linked to the flexibility that CEDA flagships? And then another participant is posing a similar question to you, but also highlighting issues of trust and risk management, that those issues of trust and risk management might be somehow behind that trend to default to larger partners. So from your perspective, what needs to happen in the system so that local and national actors can gain access to funding? Over to you, Susanna.
Okay, I think this is a very good question. Of course, goes without saying, a question that we are debating fervently on daily basis here at the humanitarian department here in CEDA, but also with our fellow colleagues within other donors and in the donor community in general. Now, when it comes to localization and local actor, one of the great questions I think that we are debating here intensively is localization a goal by itself? Or is efficient humanitarian action the goal? If it's the later, and that's what we firmly believe in at CEDA, then if we move backwards, then we think local actors or working with local actors is usually, often, a very good methodology to ensure an efficient humanitarian response. But I'm saying very often, but not necessarily always. But also we don't have to forget that in working with local actors, it's not only about funding. Funding is the easy part, but it's also about ensuring that local actors have the architecture needed to ensure an efficient humanitarian response in these very fragile, volatile contexts. So for us, it could be easy to fund local actors on the ground, small, nimble actors that can move very quickly. But do they have the security arrangements, the logistics arrangements, in COVID-19, the cold chain arrangements, the ability to ensure efficient negotiation in terms of humanitarian access arrangements, humanitarian coordination arrangements, to enable them to work in these very difficult settings? So what we're thinking, at least here at CEDA, is we need to reach local actors, but preferably through an agency or an organization that can provide these small local actors with that sort of architecture and protection that is needed to enable them to work at the front lines. Let's not forget that in 2019 was record-breaking in terms of humanitarian losing their lives in duty, right? But out of these 139, 94% were locals. So I, as a donor, need to be very careful and pay very close attention to what are the negative consequences, the unexpected negative consequences if I only fund local actors. It has to come in parallel with something else, with a structure that would enable local actors to operate in these very difficult environments. So it's not only about funding, that's what I want to get at. It's about funding, but also ensuring, if you want to call it capacity development, capacity building, for me it's more about enabling environment, ensuring an architecture around each local actor that would help them, enable them, ensure that they have the sort of access, logistical, operational frameworks that are needed to ensure an efficient humanitarian response, which is the main goal.
Great. Thanks so much, Susanna. I'd like now to give the floor back to Lydia. Lydia, if there are any points from the recent interventions that you'd like to pick up and comment on, over to you, Lydia. Okay, we're just reconnecting Lydia's audio. It'll be just a moment. Okay. Okay, great. And before, so we're going to have to move to closing remarks relatively soon, but wanted to check in with you, Ben, if you'd like to pick up on any of the points that have been raised in the last couple of interventions. If you have any reactions, further reactions, you can share. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, I struggled preparing for this panel to find my long lost optimist. But here's the best I can do. I agree with Jan. There's an awful lot of money going to other things that matter less. If international ODA is 150 billion, let's not pay for the cement factory in Kazakhstan. You know, let's do the life-saving stuff first. And some of this mid-range, middle-income country so-called development, I don't really get it. I don't really understand it. I don't think it probably makes very much difference in economic terms. I think if I was an advocate for one of your aid organizations, I would spend my day finding stupid development projects and mocking them. And I would also pay somebody to understand the World Bank better, because for some reason the donors, and I'd love Suzanne to speak to this, the donors give money to World Bank and then the World Bank does humanitarian. So adding another layer somehow makes it possible. But I think there are huge opportunities. I think the nexus is a red herring. That the opportunity is there for one of the other things that's a positive, I think, is now social protection is a mainstream concept across the international aid sector and developing country governments, that there's some sort of elastic social protection, social security system is the way to go. And I see some forward-looking aid agencies working on that. So I welcome that. And I think finally the other area, which is a bit niche to my world, but I think some of the harms of the international geopolitical space that we're in are now becoming evident. And I'll give you one example, which is misinformation. If we can tackle misinformation on coronavirus, we will, I think, learn useful skills. and get some so-called muscle memory for all the other things that threaten to undermine and disrupt our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And Lydia, do we have you now on the line?
I hope so. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that sounds great. So
Okay.
You have the floor.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to say a quick word on change and how the system changes. I think hopefully it should go without saying that we definitely do need to change, but we have a number of structural problems in the humanitarian, but also the wider crisis financing system that makes it difficult for us to change. So I think first of all, we lack a constituency in the way that a government or a business would. We have this broken feedback loop with the populations that we are designed to serve, which starves us of this kind of evolutionary stimulus. So that in itself is problematic. And we tend to respond to large scale, sort of embarrassing crises where we respond quite badly as opportunities to change. We reform a little bit and then momentum drops off and we go back to business as usual. And so we're stuck in this cycle of kind of incremental partial changes. And I think one of the real challenges that we also have as a system is that it's sort of nobody in particular's job to think on behalf of the whole system. So we each own bits of the problem and we each think about which bits are relevant to our own particular sector or parochial interests. And that means that nobody at the end of the day is asking the really big questions about what it is that we want the humanitarian system ultimately to do, what kind of a safety net we want to be providing for the world. We have this bunch of institutions which have evolved for various historical reasons, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that it has to be, or that that's the best configuration to respond to the sorts of crises that we face now and in the future. So who is asking those big questions? And that is my question to all of you. There should be somebody somewhere at the same time as we continue to respond and continue to work on all of the careful reforms that are already on the table, asking those big questions, looking into the future, looking at the types of crises, the scale of crises, and what sorts of system we would need in order to respond to that, and therefore how we would start to think about financing that. And that's a big gap that I see at the moment, and something which it's a shame that the ERC had to leave, because it would be great to put that question to him and to maybe reflect on what the role of OCHA could be with that kind of challenge. But I think that's the level of thinking that we definitely start to need quite urgently. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lydia. And I would also like to thank everyone who is writing in on the chat. It's a very lively discussion happening there as well. For all of you who are able to follow both the audio and the chat at the same time, you will, of course, have access to that in the recording of the event in case you'd like to go back and review the discussion on the sidelines as well. So now as we approach the end of our planned time, we have, I think, a clearer picture, certainly of the shortfalls of the system, also some, at least, glimmers of hope to build on those things that work and work well, and also a couple of possibly concrete steps. I'd like to wrap up by asking each of our panelists who are still with us now what they would suggest as a couple of concrete actionable steps that can be taken in the next year to address some of the many issues, many challenges that have arisen during the discussion today. I'll go first to Susanne. Over to you.
Okay, and it in a way reflects also, I think, Lydia's reflections earlier. How can we move forward, and who is asking those questions? Our thoughts about the near future is the following. We have a dramatic increase in humanitarian needs. I myself just looked at FTS this morning, and I think we're still at 28% of funding. And this is September. It's unprecedented. We've never had such low humanitarian funding, low levels of humanitarian funding this late at the year. At the same time, we know that resources might stagnate in the years to come. So the gap between needs and resources might increase. That is one set of facts that we have to deal with. And the second set of facts is that we do live in an increasingly polarized world. And as Jan was alluding also to earlier, that we do have a certain element of politicization of humanitarian aid. So what does these two elements in conjunction tell us? They tell us that unless there is a clear, crystal clear guidance for humanitarian actors, humanitarian donors, to where it comes to how and where humanitarian funding should go, I think it will give you leeway to earmark increasingly and direct humanitarian funding to other sorts of causes than the humanitarian assistance based on impartiality, whether it's mass media attention, whether it's security, political, economic, etc. So what I'm trying to say is one tangible and concrete way of moving forward, and this is something that SEED is heavily engaged with in close collaboration with OCHA, is to look at the HRP and HNO structure. And we're not the first generation looking at the HNO and HRP structure. But what we need to do in the coming future is have HNOs and HRPs that in a way are, I'm not going to say realistic, because what is realistic in a country such as Central African Republic? But it has to give donor much more guidance in which are the most prioritized pressing needs that we as donors are we're simply responsible to finance, and urgently so. Because then it will become much more difficult for donors to finance other sorts of projects and needs based on other criteria than humanitarian needs and needs alone. So we need to look at the HRP structure, the HNO structure, in a way that it would strategically direct humanitarian financing to humanitarian needs based on a severity scale. That's one. Secondly, all needs that wouldn't rank highly in a severity scale, then we as donors, but also the UN agencies and NGOs, we have to collectively work much more in stringence in terms of moving closer to our development colleagues, helping our development colleagues to come geographically, physically closer to us as humanitarian community on the ground. What we need is a transitional shift here from humanitarian to development. Whether we call it early recovery or prevention, basically what we need is a development methodology, a development portfolio to work persistently, even if a situation is fragile and unstable. We need that courage from development portfolios to ensure a development model, even in areas which are fragile and slightly unstable. Not the most unstable ones, not where there's an ongoing civil complex emergency or civil war. Humanitarians will handle those cases. But all other cases where you have chronic low-level crisis for 10 years or more, we need a development methodology. You need to use that methodology and apply it in contexts that are still slightly fragile or unstable. And from CEDA's perspective, we are sitting on daily basis with our development colleagues with maps to try to see on geographical basis where are areas where humanitarians have been lingering, in a sense, I'm using a bit of a harsh word here, lingering year after year after year, simply because lack of other sorts of aid. And still these are areas that easily could be transformed from a humanitarian financing stream to a more development, robust, multi-year and development methodology that would lead that transition from, or facilitate that transition rather, from humanitarian to development. Last bit from my end, we need more concentrated efforts on ensuring immediate peace dividends. I'm saying immediate peace dividends, not peace dividends, because out of the 15 largest humanitarian crises we are working with, I see that 5 of them have just emerged from peace consultations. All of these 5 have peace agreements signed. What's lacking is a quick transformation from humanitarian to development, i.e. peace dividends on the ground to ensure that peace process to become a reality for people living in those crises. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanne. Really appreciated having you in the discussion today. Thank you for being a part of the panel. I'd like to turn now to Hibak for your thoughts, Hibak, on local national NGO perspectives, and in particular, again, what are some concrete actions that you can take, the organizations that you're working with can take in the next year to address some of the issues discussed today. Over to you, Hibak.
Thanks. I believe the next actionable steps that can and should be taken by all actors within the ecosystem, for and with local and national NGOs, are a few things. But to start, I think it's important to continue to recognize that local actors are at times a part of the affected communities. They're there before, during, and after a response, and this is really evident during the COVID-19 pandemic. I agree with Suzanne's earlier comment that access to the larger infrastructure around coordination and information is important, but I disagree that it needs to happen through intermediaries, and that duty of care is a barrier to why local actors can and should not be directly supported. I think we really need to think outside the box, beginning with how we view intermediaries. To become more effective and efficient, we need to focus on more innovative financing solutions by sharing learnings and examples of diverse financing models, both within and outside the humanitarian sector, with the focus of course, with the development sector as well, amongst local and international actors. Local and national NGOs, really, we must claim our space within this collective ecosystem. Local and national organizations must take the lead in setting and implementing the humanitarian agenda at the national and local level. Spaces for local and national organizations to engage in groups like the Grand Bargain and other coordination mechanisms in their country must be open, transparent, and truly equitable. And using tools like the NEAR's localization performance measurement framework to better understand, evaluate how localization is working for all parties where gaps exist and where solutions are needed, and really hold all of us to account within the ecosystem. And finally, I wanted to say a large amount of resources go to capacity building. We really need to influence our sector to shift from capacity building to capacity and knowledge sharing as a measure of efficiency and effectiveness. There's a depth of knowledge which exists among all actors of the humanitarian sector, and it's important to recognize that and to begin to work in unison, really not in competition, to go back to these holistic approaches and really stepping back and seeing what each of us are doing within the ecosystem instead of a siloed approach, really a coordinated approach. And finally, to say our resources are limited and our needs continue to increase. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hibak. It's really been a pleasure having you on the panel today as well. And now turning to Jan, to you as well, what are some closing thoughts you'd like to leave us with, and also what are a couple of concrete steps that you see can be taken in the short term to address some of these issues? Over to you, Jan.
I think the first and most basic conclusion is we cannot give up, really here. So keep up your optimism, Ben. We need you to prod us and also come with proposals and help us push this. The pandemic is devastation that we haven't seen for quite some time. And the climate crisis could be much worse, and it will be accelerating. And here's the justice element, of course. Those who are first and hardest hit by the climate crisis did nothing to cause it. So it's a moral imperative to do much more. So we're not giving up. NRC, myself, we will be trying to push as much as we can. We need allies among our sister organizations, INGOs, NGOs, and so on. The aim is to reach people in great need in their hour of greatest need and help them out of their system, help them help themselves. Of course, they get out of dependency, durable solutions. At times, this may be the local organizations. They're closest to the people. They have the biggest possibility to do that. In some circumstances, it could be INGOs working with them or independently. We're in places where there's no other organized response capacity at all. We try to specialize in some of these hard-to-reach areas. So it could be us. It could be a UN agency. The point is, it's all about them. It's not about us. There's too much of this. There's too little to the NGOs. There's too much to the NGOs. There's too much to the UN. There's too little to the UN, etc. We have to look at the needs of the people, and very often, admittedly, those closest to the people are the local national organizations, and they need a bigger resources. So we'll spearhead dialogue beyond the humanitarian sector as well. Our pie is too little compared to the needs. It's really too small. When there are very few nations who give even 0.7% of their wealth to foreign aid, and they may give, a fraction of that to humanitarian assistance. It's not going to be enough. So we also need to, beyond with the private sector, like to have allies in really getting the big resources in the private sector into this area. So far, there are some very promising signs, but there is a lot of talk still. So we're going to continue, and I'm very glad that we had this opportunity today to prod here. Of course, the OCHA, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, the Interagency Standing Committee, all of these bodies exist, and we need also to push them to play a leadership role here on behalf of the humanitarian system. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jan. And now to Ben, what will you be looking out for, watching for in the months ahead on this issue as you continue to follow it? Over to you.
Well, to follow my point earlier, the people we had today are the ones who are working on the drop, and the bucket is large, and we are like experts on this drop. 2 days from now, I'm doing a panel with the big donors and the OECD. So I'm starting to think, how can I flip the script towards them? I think I would say the same message. Really, don't put all your effort into analyzing why humanitarian is a mess, but maybe consider whether some of the development money could be better spent first. So yeah, my first point is who's in the room. I don't think there's much point arguing about this tiny crumbs that the humanitarian sector gets to play with. And second point, if I may, I think there's some taboos that have yet to be smashed. The UN helping Sweden decide what is important when the UN gets and spends and consumes the money is not a great model for independent needs assessment and prioritization. That was something that didn't get through the World Humanitarian Summit, independent needs assessment. I would put that back on the table, given the look at the appeals that we've seen come out recently. And then I would repeat my point earlier. I think there's opportunity here to do it differently and to speak a language that has previously been uncomfortable. And so I look forward to hearing more of that. And if anybody can tell me what I should tell the donors on Thursday, let me know, please. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Ben. Thanks for your time today. And before we end the session, I would just like to take an opportunity, this is a first for us, to take a more visual approach to look at some of the takeaways from the discussions. NRC was able to identify someone who was able to live prepare these points in a visual manner as we are speaking. So thanks to Sarah for the efforts over the last 90 minutes to put this together. It's on 2 pages, so we'll consider this first 3 pages. We'll consider this first one and then look at the next 2 just briefly, and we'll be sharing this with everyone in the follow-up email as well. So as we see front and center in the biggest font right in the middle of that first page, rethink. So that was a big theme that Sarah heard and represented here. Rethink, decision making, coherence, acting with coherence, some of the major themes that came out. Also a sense of that optimism, the opportunities for policymakers, opportunities in the environment to establish new policies moving forward. Looking to the next page, we see front and center huge lack of funding and a lot of issues flowing from that, and we see that visually. The issue of new funding, needing to work more at a local level, co-funding, and also that it's not about changing everything. So I won't go in great detail through all of this, but I think it may be very interesting for those of you who were in the call today to consider these when they come out by email, and also to share them with colleagues as a way to keep this important discussion going. Just to wrap up, looking on the third page, we see there what Sarah is really highlighting is the frustration versus good structure of the system, and also the theme of social protection in the mainstream, and really that issue of national and local actors, of course, continuing to come out as a strong theme through everything. So thanks again, Sarah, and thanks to NRC for making that possible. Very interesting indeed, and helpful to have as the follow-up, and as I say, to ensure that we can keep the debates going, because clearly not everything is settled. Not everyone sees the problems from the same perspective. So very important to keep the discussions rolling at all levels. So now to wrap up today, if you've not already downloaded it, NRC's study can be downloaded by clicking on the link you should see in front of you now. My colleague is also sharing that link in the chat. As I mentioned, there will be a recording of the event. There's both a video and an audio-only podcast format. Those will be available on the event page in the coming days. And I hope that you will consider joining us this Thursday on the 17th of September for our next webinar, where we will be looking at how to implement the new IASC guidelines on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian response in the COVID-19 response. So with that, we'd like to thank everyone, panelists, participants, for a very interesting discussion, and thanks also to the PHAP and NRC teams behind the scenes for making today's event possible. Thank you. This is Ann Lang signing off from Geneva.